Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 236, the new member of the Weasley choir. The day before the holidays, the grades were finally released, and Kyle, with a perfect score, was unchallenged at the top of his year. This result came as a shock to many who had always assumed Kyle's performance had been subpar. In fact, even Kyle himself was stunned. Had Snape really awarded him a perfect score again? Kyle had previously believed that the perfect score Snape gave him last year was a one-off, likely because he had saved Conna from Orin. Family ties, after all, could explain such gratitude. But this year? Was it because he'd saved Harry? That didn't quite add up. Harry wasn't that important to Snape. Well, maybe Harry was, in a strange way. Kyle still couldn't make sense of it. Surely, it wasn't that Snape had suddenly turned over a new leaf and decided to be a decent teacher. That notion seemed absurd. Kyle would sooner believe that Voldemort was secretly working for a Muggle intelligence agency. That, at least, sounded more reasonable. Yet there were others who thought this outcome was entirely predictable. Fred and George had declared in the common room with exaggerated confidence, "That's the funniest joke I've heard all year. Honestly, I'd sooner believe our little brother Ron could be made prefect than that Kyle would ever fail an exam." Conna was similarly unwavering. She didn't believe Professor McGonagall had been shaking her head because Kyle had supposedly failed, but rather that there must be some other explanation, and she was right. Some younger students, consumed by doubt, even mustered the courage to ask Professor McGonagall directly, only to be reprimanded. She told them she was merely a bit disappointed that the gap between Kyle and the other students was so vast. Of course, that was only her official line. No one really knew what McGonagall was truly thinking. In any case, the school year was finally over. A notice prohibiting the use of magic over the holidays was handed out to everyone, and soon after, students either took a carriage or boarded a ferry to leave Hogwarts and catch the train back to King's Cross. "Hermione, you didn't really have to compete with Kyle," Harry said, looking at her sympathetically in the train compartment as she scowled in frustration. "After all, he's the youngest recipient of the Order of Merlin. You did really well, and you're still top of the year. But I didn't get full marks." Hermione snapped, tugging at her tangled hair in frustration. "You only lost a few points in potions," Harry said, glancing around and lowering his voice. "It's Snape. No matter how perfect your potion is, if you're not a Slytherin, he'll find something to take points off for." "But Kyle isn't a Slytherin either," Hermione retorted, frowning. "And he still got full marks, so it's not impossible. I must have messed something up. Maybe I heated it too long. The book says 20 seconds, but I forgot it also takes time to extinguish the flame. And those Valerian stems, too, I think I picked two that were too long." As Hermione meticulously reviewed every step of the forgetfulness potion in her mind, her expression grew more intense with each imagined mistake. Meanwhile, Harry and Ron exchanged increasingly uneasy glances. They hadn't planned on spending the start of their holidays talking about grades, exams, and especially not the potions exam. Ron, growing visibly irritable, turned away and stared into the corridor, hoping for a distraction. Just then, Kyle happened to pass by their compartment, followed by a crowd of younger students, chattering eagerly and clearly impressed. The corridor was filled with murmurs and excited whispers about Kyle, still basking in the glow of his recent Order of Merlin award. "That's incredible," Ron muttered under his breath. "If I could get the Order of Merlin and all top marks, Mum would be..." "Oh no." Ron's face suddenly turned pale as a thought struck him. Alarmed, Harry looked over. "What's wrong? Are you hungry? I've got some snacks." "No, Harry," Ron said, his expression grim. "Do you remember what I told you? Kyle lives next door to us." "Yeah, I remember." There was a trace of envy in Harry's voice. The idea of living near friends and classmates in a magical village was, to him, the ultimate dream. Mom must have heard already. Ron's voice wavered. I'm done for. He had thought his grades were decent, he'd passed, hadn't he? But now, next to Kyle's spotless report card, his marks suddenly seemed, well, unimpressive. And then there was Percy, too. His brother had topped 5th year, and his next-door neighbor had topped 2nd year. Ron could already see the summer unfolding in front of him. Last year, Fred and George's shouts had been loud enough to drive the garden gnomes away, and he'd given their bellowing the nickname the Weasley Choir, good for scaring off gnomes. But this year, he might be joining in the chorus. As Ron sat there lamenting, Harry silently reached over and patted him on the shoulder, his earlier envy evaporating. Maybe having a high-achieving neighbor wasn't as ideal as he'd thought. Besides, he didn't have to worry about that. The Dursleys couldn't have cared less about his grades, so even if he returned with all zeros, he'd be spared the lectures. Actually, they'd probably be pleased if he got zeros. They might even give him an extra piece of dry bread that Dudley had left over for breakfast. Having no one to compare himself to, and no one who cared about his grades, was probably the only perk of living with the Dursleys. Harry wanted to laugh at the thought, but the feeling sat uncomfortably in his chest. Next to him, Hermione finally stopped analyzing the exam. She looked over at Ron, whose face was clouded with worry, and opened her mouth to say something, but held back. Truthfully, she couldn't quite understand his disappointment and wasn't sure how to reassure him. If only I could be like Kyle. Ron sighed wistfully. Meanwhile, in a compartment not far from Harry and his friends, Kyle was glancing around nervously. Are you sure we're in the clear? No one followed us, right? It's all good. Cedric reassured him, sticking his head out into the corridor for a quick check. Once he was certain no one was around, he slipped back in, pulling the door shut and securing it with an imperturbable charm from his wand. Phew, finally lost them, Kyle muttered, exhaling in relief as he pulled off his cloak of invisibility. Who would have thought he wouldn't need the cloak for sneaking around the castle at night, but that it'd come in handy on the train home instead. The crowds had been just a bit too eager this time. Without the cloak, he might still be surrounded by admirers, each more enthusiastic than the last. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 237, Nicholas Flamel's invitation. The Hogwarts Express rolled through golden fields of wheat and small villages, the scenery flashing by the windows. Inside their compartment, Kyle had tucked away his cloak of invisibility, while Fred and George sat across from him, absorbed in a game of wizard chess. Unlike their usual lightheartedness, the twins wore serious expressions as they focused on the board. A few days prior, they had boldly challenged Ron to a game of wizard chess, determined to prove they could conquer Professor McGonagall's giant chessboard array just as Ron had. The result had been a crushing defeat that left them questioning their skills. Unwilling to accept that Ron had bested them, Fred and George vowed to practice and settle the score over the holidays. Kyle, however, doubted they'd succeed. In his view, Fred and George's talents lay firmly in pranks and inventions, while their chess skills could only be called mediocre. What are your plans for the holidays? Cedric asked suddenly, breaking the silence. My father promised to take me to France, Cho answered eagerly. I've wanted to go ever since you mentioned it last year. Cedric raised an eyebrow, grinning. Let me guess, you're interested in seeing Beau's batons. Cho nodded, not bothering to deny it. She'd read that Beau's batons was said to be the most beautiful of the 3 major European wizarding schools, famed for its elegant architecture and a crystal astrological tower. The tower, she'd heard, not only charted the orbits of the planets but changed color according to the constellations visible at any given time. She found the idea enchanting. Next to her, Kyle started to say something but then stopped, realizing that Beau's batons was likely hidden. Much like a place protected by the Fidelius charm, the school would be concealed from anyone who hadn't been invited. Even if Cho searched all through the Pyrenees, she probably wouldn't find it. But Kyle kept his thoughts to himself, assuming Cedric, who'd seen Beau's batons during his visit last year, was already aware of this. I'm going to watch the match, Cedric continued, between the Wrotsa Vultures and the Chudley Cannons. My dad promised to take me. It's at the end of the month, want to come? I'll probably still be in Paris, Cho replied, smiling. Kanna, who had been quietly listening, shook her head. I might go to a match too, but it's not Quidditch. It's a Wizarding School Potions Championship, one held every 3 years in Asia. At this, Fred, who had been focused on the chessboard, suddenly looked up. Is Snape the one taking you? Snape was distantly related to Kanna, and the group already knew that he'd purchased a house near her family's. Kanna herself had told them, and though it had been a bit of a surprise, they had taken the news in stride. After all, Kanna was the only non-Slytherin student Snape ever awarded points to, a fact they'd noticed long ago, though they'd never quite believed it. Contrary to Kanna's initial worry, Fred and George hadn't distanced themselves from her after learning about her connection to Snape. They disliked Snape on his own merits, it didn't change how they felt about Kanna. Besides, familial connections were common in the wizarding world. Technically, the Weasleys and the Malfoys were distantly related, too, but that didn't stop Mr. Weasley from feuding with Lucius Malfoy every chance he got. Yes. Kanna nodded slightly. He thinks I should watch more of these kinds of competitions. All right. Cedric replied, giving a thoughtful nod. Fred and George also declined Cedric's invitation. They had plans to work on new products for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes over the break, so traveling wasn't in the cards for them. When the Chudley Cannons came up, Kyle gave a small, disdainful sniff, clearly unimpressed. Cedric hadn't actually intended to invite Kyle, but instead asked casually about his holiday plans. I don't know. I'll probably go out for a bit, too, Kyle said after thinking for a moment. He recalled that in the headmaster's office, MacPhail had mentioned that Nicholas Flamel had hoped to join them this time, though his health wouldn't permit the long journey. However, Flamel had sent Kyle a letter, which MacPhail had brought along. In it, Flamel included congratulations and well wishes, along with an invitation for Kyle to visit his home. He'd promised that, if Kyle accepted, someone would come to fetch him in a week. Kyle, thrilled at the opportunity, had quickly written a reply, which Dumbledore's Phoenix, Fawkes, helped deliver. Since Flamel's residence was under the Fidelius charm and couldn't be located by conventional means, only Fawkes could reach it. To ensure the letter's delivery, Kyle had bribed Fawkes with a bag of rue leaves and 5 precious ladies' mantles. With any luck, Kyle would also be in France by the following week. Oh, you're all so busy, George sighed dramatically, suddenly sweeping his hand across the chessboard and scattering the pieces. Makes it look like Fred and I are the only ones out of step. Fred, holding the queen and poised to strike George's king, glanced up, gritting his teeth. I was about to win. Oh, sorry, I wasn't paying attention, George chuckled. It's just disappointing, everyone's leaving us. Don't you understand how that feels? Fred scoffed, giving George an unimpressed look. He knew exactly what George was up to, after all, he'd had the same thought himself. George was just looking for a way to back out of the game. Fine. Fred said with a sly smile. The pieces can just reset themselves, let's keep playing. Nah, I'm not in the mood for chess anymore, George replied, shrugging and looking down. Besides, those pieces are tricky. Who knows if they'll put themselves in favorable spots. Ha! Fred snickered, amused by the excuse. It was a brilliant one, why hadn't he thought of it? As expected, he could never quite match George in sheer shamelessness. As the train neared King's Cross Station, Fred suddenly seemed to remember something. If I write to you, will you be able to receive it? He asked. Cedric thought for a moment. I think so. The post office offers long-distance delivery, but it's pretty expensive. I'll pass, Kyle said with a shrug. The owls probably won't even be able to find my address. If you want to write to me, just slip the letter into my house. I'll read it when I get back. Ha, who'd write to you? Fred laughed. George chimed in with mock disapproval. Yeah, we wouldn't waste galleons on you. Only moments ago, Fred and George had been ready to face off in chess, but they were back to being a united front now, laughing together. Oh, that reminds me. Kyle said, giving them a calm, knowing look. Cedric, wasn't someone supposed to fly a trophy over Hogwarts? Cedric smirked. Yes, and throw in a tap dance too. Right. Tap dancing on a flying broomstick. Now that would be something. I'd definitely take a picture of that to remember it. Fred and George fell silent instantly. They both remembered all too well that they'd once said that, never imagining Kyle would actually receive the Order of Merlin while still in second year. But it was too late to regret that now. Amid the group's laughter, the train gradually slowed down and finally came to a halt at platform 9 3/4. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 238, The Department of Mysteries. Early that morning, Kyle went downstairs for breakfast, as usual. Chris was the only one in the living room. Diana, in fact, had not returned since the last investiture ceremony. Kyle had already asked Chris about it, but he didn't seem to know much either, aside from mentioning that the Department of Mysteries mission appeared exceptionally important this time. Just 2 days ago, the entire 9th floor of the Ministry of Magic, where the Department of Mysteries is located, had been completely sealed off. The elevators could no longer reach it, and even the enchanted paper airplanes carrying messages were halted outside. Not even the minister, Cornelius Fudge, could get in. The minister had lost his temper over this. Yet, no matter how furious Fudge got or how many times he banged his head against the elevator doors, the 9th floor remained closed. Unlike other departments within the ministry, the Department of Mysteries enjoyed significant independence and wasn't under the minister's direct jurisdiction. After all, it had existed long before the Ministry of Magic was established, and technically, the two entities merely cooperated with each other. Typically, the unspeakables might show Fudge some deference, but in extraordinary circumstances, things were different. At times like these, Fudge, the so-called minister, held less significance in their eyes than a crystal ball of prophecy. I wonder if this mission of the Department of Mysteries has anything to do with Voldemort, Kyle mused, feeling a twinge of curiosity. But unfortunately, Diana never shared any details about the department's work with him. Today marks the second week of your vacation, right? Chris asked, handing Kyle a plate of bacon as they sat at the dining table. His tone held a hint of apprehension. Are you sure that was really a letter from Mr. Nicholas Flamel? Dad, I've explained this many times already, Kyle replied, setting down his bread with a sigh. The letter was given to me by Mr. McPhail, and Headmaster Dumbledore approved it. They wouldn't joke about something like that. I know, but it's Nicholas Flamel. Chris still sounded incredulous. As a legendary wizard spanning 6 centuries, Nicholas Flamel was a figure of immense renown. It could be said that wherever there were wizards, there were legends of him. Meeting him was nearly impossible for most, and the idea of Kyle being invited as his guest was astonishing. Since hearing the news, Chris had been caught in a sense of disbelief. Kyle bit into his bread, exasperated yet resigned. Chris had been acting this way for days now, and Kyle had grown used to it. It's just an invitation, he thought. Why is he so surprised? After all, I am the youngest person to receive the Order of Merlin, it shouldn't be such a big deal. Bang, bang. A knock sounded at the door. Is that the person here to pick you up? Chris asked. I don't think so, Kyle replied calmly, shaking his head. Today was indeed the scheduled day, but it was still too early, barely 8 o'clock. Besides, the knock on the door was unmistakably familiar, the kind he'd heard almost daily around this time last year. Kyle got up and walked over to the door. As he opened it, 2 identical faces appeared in front of him. Kyle. Thank goodness you're still home, George said with visible relief. We remembered you were leaving today. It was, in fact, Fred and George. Kyle looked entirely unsurprised. With a steady expression, he said, Come in, let's talk. Fred peered over Kyle's shoulder, then shook his head in mock seriousness. No, you're probably busy today. We won't take up your time. We're just here to borrow your owl. Borrow my owl? Kyle raised an eyebrow, surprised. He had assumed they'd be asking to use the attic again for their skiving snack box experiments, like last year. Besides, he thought the Weasley family's owl, despite its age, was still in good health under Chris's recent care and could manage a letter delivery. Yes, Fred explained, a grin tugging at his lips. The skiving snack box line is a hit. We've gotten so many orders, even during the holidays. We need to send out our goods, George added, producing a parchment densely packed with names. That's quite a few names, Kyle remarked, still a bit surprised. But they're not even in school right now. What do they need fat tongue toffees for? Ah, but have a look, Fred replied, grinning. Most of the names are first-year wizards, all snapping up the fat tongue toffees. They can't use magic at home over the holidays, George added, but these treats let them show a bit of magic anyway. George and I thought it up just before break, Fred said, obviously pleased with himself. We even dialed down the swelling solution so the tongue wouldn't grow too much. It's been a huge hit. Fred's expression darkened slightly. Only problem is, Percy the Brainiac's been hogging Errol lately and won't let us use him. Got it. Kyle nodded, walked to the door, and raised his arm. Rattan. A massive owl swooped down from the nearby woods, its belly rounded, looking as if it had just returned from a buffet. Magnificent, Fred murmured in awe. Even after all this time, Rattan's size was still impressive. The owl was easily twice the size of Errol, practically a giant among owls. Somehow, Kyle had managed to keep him in such impressive shape. As he looked at Rattan, Fred seemed to recall something and lowered his voice. Does he follow other owls around when they're out delivering? What are you plotting? Kyle asked, eyeing him suspiciously. Are they planning to have him tail someone? That would be going too far. Did they want to end up in Azkaban just to develop more clients? It's not just any owl, George said mysteriously. It's Percy's. He keeps claiming he's sending letters to swap homework with other prefects. But we don't buy it, Fred added. The way he acts when he's delivering them, he looks like a gnome who's just pinched a potato. We want to find out who he's really writing to. Kyle shook his head firmly. I'd advise against that idea. Rattan wouldn't agree to it, no owl would. They might even go on strike. Don't worry, Fred said with an innocent smile. We know owls won't agree. We were just talking. We weren't actually going to do it. Kyle saw the mischievous glints in Fred and George's eyes and realized they were putting on an act just to rile him up. George shrugged, still smirking. Anyway, we'd better get moving to deliver these goodies our customers have been eagerly waiting for. That's much more important than nosy old Percy and his big head. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 239, A Luxurious Way to Travel. After realizing that Fred and George were only joking, Kyle handed Rattan over to them. However, Rattan was still somewhat uneasy, hovering in mid-air and keeping a wary eye on the twins. Hey, we were just joking, Fred said, looking a bit embarrassed. Rattan, however, pretended not to hear. You really shouldn't make comments like that in front of owls, Kyle advised. But he's agreed to help deliver your packages. So, what does he eat every day? Owl nuts? George asked. Errol usually didn't need special food. If they ever needed supplies, they could easily pick some up in Diagon Alley. No need to feed him, he'll find his own food, Kyle instructed. Just give him some water every time he comes back from a delivery. I think it's best if we buy him some owl treats as a peace offering, Fred said, grimacing. That's fine, Kyle chuckled. After all, discussing tailing another owl right in front of Rattan, it's no wonder he was suspicious. Even Errol would likely give them the cold shoulder for a few days after a stunt like that. Oh, by the way, when will you be back? Fred asked, glancing up at Kyle's attic with a hint of longing. "We've already been caught twice by my mom while making skiving snack boxes this week. It was a disaster." "I'm not sure," Kyle replied thoughtfully. "Probably just a day or two. I'm only visiting as a guest, so I shouldn't be gone long." "That's good," Fred said, brightening up. "We still have loads of new ideas we want to try out." "And at home, Mum would never allow it," George finished with a sigh. After seeing Fred and George off, Kyle turned back, intending to finish his breakfast. But as soon as he stepped inside, he noticed someone else had appeared in the living room, seemingly out of nowhere. "Professor Dumbledore?" Kyle asked in surprise. "When did you get here?" "Just now, while you were chatting with the Weasleys," Dumbledore replied with a smile. "Chris was about to call you, but I thought it best to let you finish. After all, there's no rush." "Sorry, Professor, I wasn't paying attention," Kyle said as he walked in. "So, are you the one picking me up this time?" "I'd love to take on the job, but unfortunately, I have a few other trivial matters keeping me here," Dumbledore said, a glint of humor in his eyes. Kyle nodded, refraining from asking further questions. He knew Dumbledore wasn't one for casual visits, so he decided to wait patiently. Settling himself nearby, Kyle half-jokingly remarked, "It's not because of the defense against the dark arts professor, is it?" "Ah, Kyle, you're as perceptive as ever," Dumbledore sighed. "Finding a suitable professor is always such a challenge. I seem to spend half my life searching. Just this past week, I've called on several old friends, but most were, conveniently, not at home, and those who were wouldn't let me in. Truthfully, it's a bit disheartening." "It's only temporary, Albus," Chris said, chuckling. "Once the term starts in September, I'm sure things will be different. Would you like some tea?" Chris poured Dumbledore a cup of tea, and Kyle offered him the sugar tin. After a sip, Dumbledore's mood seemed to lift. "But all is not lost," he said with a faint smile. "Dugald has recommended someone to me, and it seems they're interested in the position." "Oh." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "This time, I can assure you it won't be a dark wizard," Dumbledore emphasized. "He's well known in the wizarding world and, like you, holds an Order of Merlin." "I trust your judgment, Professor," Kyle said sincerely. "So, does this mean we have a new defense against the dark arts professor?" "Not quite," Dumbledore replied, his eyes twinkling thoughtfully. "The teaching materials this candidate has requested are extensive and costly, which has me hesitating. I'm just wondering if anyone else might take the job." "And if not?" Kyle asked. "Then it will have to be him," Dumbledore said with a resigned sigh, finishing his tea. He glanced out the window and remarked, "Oh, it's nearly time. Are you all set for the journey, Kyle?" "Of course, Professor." Kyle patted his moleskin pouch, which was now carrying a regular bag enchanted with the undetectable extension charm. Though compact, it held more than enough for his trip. "So, will Fawkes be taking me there?" Kyle inquired. "That's certainly one option," Dumbledore said with a smile. "But I don't think you'd enjoy traveling by Phoenix. It's a bit jarring for wizards, and even I haven't fully gotten used to it." "No, we have a better method." Dumbledore reached into his pocket, drawing out a small, glimmering red stone fragment and placing it on the table. "A Philosopher's Stone." "It's a fragment of the Philosopher's Stone," Dumbledore clarified. "The original stone was destroyed, and it no longer holds its magical properties. However, we found another use for the fragments, as portkeys. Portkeys made from Philosopher's Stone fragments are quite stable and ideal for long-distance travel." Kyle's eyelid twitched slightly. A portkey made from a fragment of the Philosopher's Stone. It felt as if he were casually holding a gold coin. Well, Kyle thought, no wonder he's been around for 6 centuries, he certainly knows how to make an impression. Dumbledore glanced out the window once more. "Are you ready, Kyle? You know how to use a portkey, don't you?" Kyle nodded, reaching out to grasp the Philosopher's Stone fragment. The coolness of the stone seeped into his palm. "Oh, and take this." Dumbledore suddenly remembered, slipping an envelope into Kyle's pocket. "Open it once you arrive in France." Kyle heard only that final instruction before everything became a blur. He felt as if someone had given him a strong push, and suddenly he was airborne. In an instant, he vanished from the living room, whisked away by the portkey. The world blurred as he was pulled forward at incredible speed, the experience entirely different from apparition. Yet, compared to the sensation of being twisted inside a washing machine, this journey was surprisingly gentle. Though not exactly comfortable, it wasn't unpleasant, and he felt none of the usual dizziness. It was manageable. After an indeterminate amount of time, Kyle felt his body lighten, and then, with a heavy thud, he landed on solid ground. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 240, Nicholas Flamel. Kyle landed with a slight thud, holding onto the fragment of the Philosopher's Stone, which spun briefly in midair before he deftly caught it. He slipped the fragment into his pocket, then looked around, taking in his surroundings. Before setting off, Kyle had anticipated all sorts of possible destinations. He had expected perhaps a grand manor, or even a secluded wizard village, somewhere remote and secretive, like Newt's home nestled deep in the mountains, hidden from prying eyes. But he hadn't imagined that he would end up on a bustling Muggle street. Kyle raised his eyebrows as he took in the sight of a large restaurant sign overhead. People strolled past, busy and preoccupied, none seeming to notice the young wizard who had suddenly appeared out of thin air. They moved around him with the ease of those who didn't see anything out of the ordinary. In the background, car horns blared intermittently, and Kyle squinted at the cityscape beyond. To his left, he caught a glimpse of a tall spire piercing the sky. Paris? Kyle muttered to himself, piecing together his whereabouts. Since he'd known from the start that he'd be going to France, he quickly regained his composure after the initial surprise. A Muggle street is as good a landing place as any, he thought. After all, it was a wizard with over 6 centuries of history. His outlook was bound to differ from that of most people. He could have arranged to meet atop the Eiffel Tower, or even in the depths of a zoo. It wouldn't have been entirely unexpected. For now, though, Kyle's priority was to locate the person he was here to meet. Kyle considered his options. Since either Nicholas Flamel or Dumbledore had likely prepared the portkey, he felt confident he was in the right place. And given Flamel's nature, it was doubtful he'd be found in any of the shops lining this busy street. Could it be the Fidelius charm? Reaching into his pocket, Kyle pulled out the envelope Dumbledore had given him before his departure. Opening it, he found a blank piece of paper. However, as soon as he unfolded it, he heard a soft, distinct whisper, a single number, 51. As soon as the number, 51, whispered in Kyle's ear, the blank paper in his hand suddenly ignited, burning to ash in an instant and falling to the ground. Kyle barely had time to process this when, just ahead, an exquisite wooden door with gilt patterns materialized between the restaurant and the record store. Pale blue walls and gleaming windows emerged, as though an entire house had pushed its way into existence, forcing the neighboring shops aside. Kyle observed the new building, intrigued. Inside the restaurant, the waitstaff continued their casual conversations, and in the record store, soft music played on, with neither business seeming to notice the sudden appearance of this elegant door. Approaching it, Kyle noticed the door had no handle, only a small indentation that looked as if something had been struck out of it, not quite a keyhole. He pulled out his wand, attempting an unlocking charm, but as expected, it had no effect. "Is this some sort of test?" he muttered. Dumbledore didn't mention anything about this. As he pondered his next move, the gilt patterns on the door began to twist, entwining to form elegant golden text, "Ahead of you lies a swift river. The song of the magic flute has destroyed the bridge leading to the other side. To continue forward, you must find the 4 lost branches. One was taken by a knight in the countryside, one struck a butterfly and was unknowingly picked up by a madam, one witnessed a wedding vow, and one flaunts above people's heads. Go forth and find them. Or, you could hand over your treasures to the sirens by the shore, they will help you cross." Kyle studied the words, his gaze narrowing thoughtfully. The meaning was clear enough. The bridge seemed to represent the door, and to unlock it, he would need to locate 4 specific items corresponding to the clues. He analyzed each line carefully, picking out the key phrases: the song of the magic flute, a night in the countryside, Madame Butterfly. Famous operas, he thought. The names of certain operas matched the clues, though he hadn't yet pieced together the last 2. So, I'm supposed to go to the opera house to find these clues? He paused, rereading the final line. The message seemed straightforward. If he preferred not to hunt down the clues, he could offer a valuable item in exchange for passage. But he knew the price here wasn't mere galleons. The indentation in the door looked suspiciously like it was meant for something specific. A thought struck him, and he reached into his pocket to pull out the Philosopher's Stone fragment. To his surprise, the fragment's size and shape matched the groove perfectly. Clearly, this was the treasure mentioned in the riddle. Nicholas Flamel didn't intend to take back this fragment of the Philosopher's Stone. Kyle mused, surprised. If he found all the clues, he might even be able to keep the stone fragment. On one hand, he could spend time solving the puzzle to retain it; on the other, he could simply use it now as a key. The choice was clear to him. With a shrug, Kyle pushed the fragment into the groove without hesitation. The Philosopher's Stone might have once been powerful enough to drive countless wizards mad with desire, but now, as a broken fragment, it was of no practical use. Like a pair of broken chopsticks or scattered Lego pieces, he thought, completely useless. Of course, it might still fetch a high price in Diagon Alley. After all, with the Philosopher's Stone as a gimmick, plenty of pureblood families would likely pay handsomely for a chance to own it. Just as he reached out to try to retrieve the shard, however, he realized it had already clicked seamlessly into place, fitting perfectly within the door's groove. The door before Kyle slowly began to dissolve into thin air, while the room beyond expanded rapidly, seeming to engulf the entire street. In what felt like the blink of an eye, the quaint shop transformed into a grand hall lined with elegant columns, and the bustling pedestrians outside vanished altogether. Kyle now stood in a vast, opulent hall. Warm yellow marble gleamed beneath his feet, and above him stretched an azure ceiling that shifted and shimmered like a living sky, its surface adorned with intricate golden symbols swirling in patterns that seemed both beautiful and cryptic. "Aha, Olymp, you lose." A familiar voice broke the silence nearby. "I told you, this kid would be the first one to arrive. Pay up. 2 galleons, fair and square." Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.